When you spend decades meeting and writing about trailblazing stars like Chuck Berry, Ray Charles, and Tammy Wynette, you end up with a lot of great stories to tell. Peter Guralnick is here to talk about his new book, Looking to Get Lost: Adventures in Music and Writing. The composer Richard Wagner was a titanic influence on all of the arts, not just music. He was also, decades after his death, Hitler's favorite composer. Alex Ross is here to talk about his new book, Wagnerism: Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. Alexandra Alter will have an update from the publishing world, and the Times' critics will join us for the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's October 30th. Filling in this week for Pamela Paul, I'm John Williams. Peter Guralnick is here. He is the author of several books about the blues and soul music and country music, as well as biographies of Sam Cooke and Sun Records founder Sam Phillips, as well as the brilliant, and I think it's safe to say definitive, 2-volume life of Elvis Presley, Last Train to Memphis, and Careless Love. His new book, Looking to Get Lost: Adventures in Music and Writing, collects pieces new and old about figures including Ray Charles, Merle Haggard, and Howlin' Wolf, among about 24 others. And he's here to talk about it. Hi, Peter.
Hi, John.
So you've written collections of sorts before, but this is a gathering, I assume, of pieces from various places. Where are the kinds of places these pieces first appeared, and how did you go about assembling them and putting them in order for the book?
Well, I'd say about a third of the book is new, and the Dick Curless, is what leans the book towards that amount of new text. But things like the Chuck Berry, the Solomon Burke, the Colonel Parker are all written for this book. This is by no means a grab bag collection of, all my work. It would have been much, much longer if it had been. But I wanted things that, for me, fitted together and established the tone, a tone of both celebration and dedication that I wanted to suggest about the people that I was writing to and also about people that I was connected to. So all of them were extensively or substantially rewritten. Some appeared in Country Music magazine. Some appeared in several places, both Country Music and the Boston Phoenix. Some appeared in the Oxford American.
You talk about writing about yourself a bit in the book, too. You add a little bit of both in the contextualizing of things, but also in the pieces themselves. You talked about how the dedication of these artists is kind of a through line. I also think there's the through line of your own dedication to this work of often writing about things that were very popular, but writing about other things that people didn't quite know as well and bringing them to the light. You write in the book about how Robert Johnson and Skip James, the first two profile subjects in the book, were among the first performers to, quote, wake you up to the music. Can you take me back to first hearing them, how old you were, what music had meant to you before that, and what changed when you heard them?
Well, I've got to say that I agree with you. The personal element, I think, is the through line of the book. And in some ways, it lent itself to the selection that I made of pieces that had written before or pieces that I created for the book. But with Robert Johnson, my awakening to it was the same as Eric Clapton's, who speaks of it in the chapter on him, as the same as Mick Jagger's and Keith Richards. It was with the release of Robert Johnson, King of the Delta Blues Singers by Columbia in 1961.
I went to the crossroads, fell down on my knees.
That record sold initially approximately 15,000 copies. And I can honestly say, I can't honestly say, I can exaggeratedly say that sometimes I think I've met all 15,000 of those people in one way or another. But it was just cataclysmic. It just turned me around completely. I mean, I had been mesmerized, completely involved in blues from the time I was 15 or 16. That really turned me around. When I first heard the records by Muddy Waters, by Sleepy John Estes, by Howlin' Wolf, even by people that I don't listen to much today, like Brownie McGhee and Sonny Terry or Big Bill Broonzy. And I can't tell you what it was that so captured me. I mean, it's captured a lot of people over the years, and I don't think Eric Clapton is able to define it any better than I am. But, I mean, I only mention Eric Clapton because he's in the book talking about it. I got this Robert Johnson album and an album by Big Joe Williams, which was nearly as cataclysmic for me, called Piney Woods Blues. I got them on the same day at Sam Goody's. I was going to Columbia at the time. And I just listened to the Robert Johnson over and over and over again. When I listen to Robert Johnson or I listen to Merle Haggard, I'm listening to it with different ears, not better ears, but just I'm hearing it differently, today than I did when I first heard it. But when I first heard the Robert Johnson, I don't think anything ever had a greater impact on me, either emotionally or artistically. And it possessed such sweeping lyricism, profundity, humor sometimes, but just what Sam Phillips used to, would call, he would say, it was real. That's REAL, real. and that's how it hit me. And I don't want to bring in the Big Joe Williams out of left field, but I that too was just had a tremendous impact on me. And I sold all my LPs a couple of years ago. I felt it was time for deaccessioning. I mean, I have all the music. I mean, so it wasn't, I had the music on CDs.
Wait. I have to pause here. You sold all of your LPs 2 years ago? How many LPs is that?
It was probably about 5,000.
And why didn't you tell me you were selling them?
I sold them to a friend of mine named Russ Colhonen, who ran a wonderful record store in Salem, Mass. Called The Record Exchange. And when he died, he left it to his friend Paul Baz, and who was still running it. And it was a great experience because they're such wonderful people. And Russ was just one of the greatest people I've ever met. But the point is, I kept 100 albums. I kept the Robert Johnson. I kept 2 or 3 Big Joe Williams. I kept Country Negro Jam Sessions on the Folk Lyric label. And I kept oddities, that just had almost more of a sentimental value to me. But the Robert Johnson, remains to this day just at the center of my musical universe.
I'm just going to stop here for 30 more seconds because I was going to ask you about your LP collection later, and I'm a bit shocked here. So I want to ask 2 things. First of all, are you saying that much of your record collection is for sale at this store in Salem?
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And secondly, I just want to put in a request, which is that if you haven't already, I would love on your website a list of the 100 albums you kept. That would be a great curiosity.
This is a piece that I wanted to write. I've been meaning to write for a long time, called My Record Collection, because I thought the title would tend to be misleading. And then I would sort of talk about some of the 100 albums that I kept, just in an affectionate manner, but also describe what it was like to sell them, and not with regret, just describe the whole thing. They were all over the house.
Waist deep in records. That's great.
Right.
Well, you have at least one curious reader, and I'm sure many, many more waiting for that piece. You always convey a deep appreciation of your subjects. I think that's one of your trademarks, but I felt like the piece about Merle Haggard in this book, and the very fun, extensive notes about him at the end of the book, is sort of particularly ardent. And a career like yours involves a lot of choices. You write these full-dress biographies, which take time, and you have to decide what you're going to put your real full attention to for a full...
Not anymore. No more full...
Well...
Enough is enough.
Okay, so I'll ask it...
25 years or 27, whatever it was.
I'll ask it retrospectively then. You say in the end of the book that there's still a crying need for a great Merle Haggard biography. So, how did you over the years decide... I'm going to write about Sam Cooke. I'm not going to write a 400-page book about Merle Haggard. How else did you sort of decide about what were going to be the longer projects?
Even though I had determined that the Sam Phillips would be the last biography I wrote, because I started with Elvis in '88. Sam Phillips came out in 2015, so that's 27 years. And that's total immersion, total dedication. And I just thought, okay, I've got to go on to do something else. But even after that, I thought if Merle called, I would feel compelled to do it. It would have been very difficult, I think, but worth taking on. I tried several times. I was very friendly with Merle's manager of many years, Tex Whitson, whom I write about some in the book, particularly in the back notes, where I give the reason why right now people should be getting Tex Whitson's email and telephone number, calling him up and taking down an oral history, because his memory of those years and his eloquence about them is it's so great. But Tex was a great advocate for me, and we could do a whole program about projects that we embarked upon that never got accomplished. At one point, he had Merle's agreement that the 3 of us would go back to Bakersfield, which is where Tex is from also, and we would do something, maybe it would have turned into a biography, we'd do something that really extensively explored Merle's roots, and I thought would flower into something even greater. And that went on for several months. But in the end, Merle just dropped out.
I could be holding you tonight. I could quit doing wrong and start doing right. You don't care about what I think I'll just stay here and drink.
One of the things about writing about anybody is you're not owed a single thing. You're there at the sufferance of the person you're writing for, and it's something never to forget and never to think, oh my God, how could this person do this to me? Because really, it's through the generosity of the person. And I would say I feel this in every case. The writing about these subjects has so expanded my own world, and being welcomed by all these people, whether it's Ernest Tubb or it's Muddy Waters, or just all of the people I've written about, having them take me in, welcome me to their world, show me their worlds in so many instances, is just an element of generosity for which I'll be forever grateful. And I'm the beneficiary. I mean, I hope they're the beneficiary in some way, but I'm the greatest beneficiary.
Well, let's talk about Dick Curless for a minute. You mentioned that you wrote a piece. It's almost sort of an anchoring novella in the book. It's about 70 pages, which is significantly longer than any of the other profiles.
Yeah, no, it really is. It's like it's like a nonfiction novella.
I'm curious about sort of what your history of knowing about his work is, and also what your podcast size pitch about why people should be curious and seek out his work would be.
Well, no, I think we have to do a full-sized novella.
You know what?
Pod novella.
Read the 70 pages, please. Turn to the book.
Well, no, I as I write about Dick, I mean, I was so inspired by the recording session that I went to, which came just 4 or 5 months before his death.
This was in the 90s sometime?
This was in 94, Christmas of 94. And it was such an astonishing experience, and it revealed a talent which I had never fully recognized. I mean, I knew Dick's work. I'd seen Dick perform. I'd been introduced to Dick by Sleepy LaBeef, another great talent who should get greater recognition. But to me, he was a gracious performer. He satisfied his audience, but I never saw the full dimensions of his talent or dedication to the music until that session. And in that session, in some ways, what I saw was someone who, had he possessed more of Merle Haggard's orneriness or resistance to others, might have had this kind of career that Merle Haggard did. My son Jake produced the album, and I wrote the liner notes at Jake's invitation for the album. And it was just a wonderful thing. And then I went and interviewed Dick about a month after the recording of the album, and he had been sick while he was making the album. He'd been to the hospital since then. He seemed to be recovering. And I stayed over a couple of nights, or maybe one. I was there for at least 2 days. And we did a pretty extensive interview in which Dick was insistent. He says, I don't want to tell the white picket fence with the roses around it kind of story. I sing songs of living and learning. And that's what I'm going to tell you. I mean, he said, in essence, that's what he said. And he just wasn't interested in fairy tales. And the story was in some ways so much more painful than I had ever imagined from meeting him at the session and spending a lot of time with him and talking to him quite a bit. Then he died a couple of months later, and I went back and spent quite a bit of time with his wife, Pauline, maybe 8 or 9 months later. And from that point on, we're now in 96, my intention was to write an extensive piece about Dick, which would expand upon the liner notes I've written, but which would really take a different tack. But then really, I didn't keep putting it off, but I didn't get around to it until after the Sam Phillips. But I really spent most of the last 2 or 3 years, much of the last 2 or 3 years, writing this piece. And one of the things that was most extraordinary to me about it was how differently it ended up in its structure than what I had imagined for 15 or 20 years. That doesn't say it's good or it's bad, but to me, that's both the price of total engagement, of total immersion in any subject. I mean, it ought to surprise you. It shouldn't. If it doesn't, then you're doing something formulaic that you shouldn't be doing. But it created problems of just how to tell it. And I think if you read the chapter, anybody who reads the chapter will see it begins with its inspiration, which was the recording session at Christmas of 94. And it goes back in the end. It's a circularity kind of. It goes back in the end to the recording session. But the story that's told in between, sometimes it was a very difficult thing to write. Sometimes I almost winced at, some of the elements of the narrative. But I wouldn't have been true to Dick had I not told that story in that way, told the story in a way that was honest and true to the life that he had led. So that's what I tried to do. And to me, writing it was not as inspiring as the recording session, but it was close.
I was glad to learn more about him. And I wonder if, of the other subjects, you have someone who you feel sort of most frustrated that they're still a bit underknown and appreciated in your view? I mean, a lot of these people obviously are very famous and well respected, and all of them are known on some level. But is there someone who you're sort of waiting for a full revival of, who you think is undervalued?
All of them, in a certain sense. I mean, but it isn't that. I don't feel frustrated. I just feel that all of them deserve greater recognition, and I'm sure their work will continue to draw that recognition and draw that attention. But I mean, I think about somebody like Doc Pomus. He's just an extraordinary person and an extraordinary songwriter. At the end of the Henry Green, I write, I expostulate, and he was the first person that I ever interviewed.
This is the British novelist,
the British novelist.
We're bringing it back to books, which is nice.
And I went to see him at his invitation. I mean, I forced myself to do it. I was just consumed with self-consciousness, but I thought, I've got to do it. It was the same reason that I interviewed Skip James a couple of years later.
Well, I want to set the scene a little bit, because this my jaw dropped a little bit as another, at that age, fairly shy, self-effacing person, as you describe yourself in the book. You're 19 years old, I think, and you go to England, and you're a big fan of Henry Green's novels. He's a famously brilliant but idiosyncratic writer, and I don't think he was particularly well known at the time as a persona. And so
no, even as a writer. I mean, John Updike was his great champion in this country and brought a good deal of attention to him. But as John Updike wrote to me when I first contacted him about Henry Green at about the same time, he said, now there are just three people in this country, or who champion him, who know about him: myself, my wife, and now you, Mr. Guralnick. I'm thinking, Mr. Guralnick, I'm 19 years old, I'm 20 years old. So what a thrill that was. Not to be called that, but to be, drawn into that company.
Of course. And so you drop him a note just saying, I'd like to drop by and say hi.
It was a much more humble note than that. But I begged his sufferance. I mean, I just I wrote to him, and he said, by all means, come ahead, Mr. Guralnick. I was Mr. again. But he had stopped publishing. He'd stopped writing, really, but he virtually stopped writing, but he stopped publishing at that point for quite some time. So he said, by all means, come ahead. And I just went in there trembling. I forced myself to go there. I spent a very long afternoon. Henry Green, as he himself said, he didn't concede, he just declared it, was something of a drinker. And he was pretty relaxed, and we just talked about just about everything, and it was just thrilling and inspiring to me. But I should say that it was the same thing that a couple of years later, I forced myself to go interview Skip James for much the same reason, and I articulated it to myself, and now subsequently articulated in writing, that I had to do this. I had to interview them, because greatness such as this would not pass my way again. I can't find where the origins of that quotation. I've said it for years, and I didn't think I made it up, but I don't know where it comes from. But I wanted to say one thing. You said, is there anybody, that I feel hasn't gotten their due? When I first interviewed Muddy Waters back in 1970, I asked him if he was disappointed in anything. Did he have any regrets? He said, yeah, that the world didn't come to know me when I was younger and could put out more. Now, this was in 1970 when he was, in his mid-50s, and he lived for another maybe 13 years, and the world did come to know him even better. But that really registered with me. As much of a hero as he was to me, somebody by whom you would measure greatness, both in the blues and just in artistic achievement, that was his perspective on it. So everybody can stand more love and kindness.
In the book, you write about how you came to see, and I'll quote, the centrality of home as the starting point for every creative endeavor, yoked to the implicit understanding that there was no way of ever getting back there again, which is a lovely sentence. I also wonder, though, if you can connect that at all to your own work as a writer and thinker, and what that idea of home means to you in terms of trying to reach something creatively.
I think that many of the people that I talked to, from Ernest Tubb to the novelist Lee Smith, who articulated this view, sought to resolve that issue by their total immersion in the work that they were presently doing. But I don't think there's any way of getting around the fact that you are, in a sense, removed from and alienated from. I mean, Lee Smith's quote, this is the novelist Lee Smith, her quote in the book, I think is particularly apt, and just as to the ways in which your journey takes you further and further from your inspiration, from the source of your inspiration. I wrote about this slightly at the end of Feel Like Going Home, when I declared, and this was in 1971, when I declared my retirement from writing about music. And, that what I wanted to do was to go back to my younger, more carefree self. I don't know if that self ever existed. Put away my notebook and just experience the music as itself, as opposed to, worrying about recording my impressions or descriptions or whatever. So 2 years later, Jim Miller, who was then the music editor at the Real paper, said, in those 2 years, I wrote another novel, which was what I felt my primary commitment was to. And then I think 2 years after the book was published, Jim Miller said, Waylon Jennings is coming to town for a week. I think that's something you'd really enjoy doing. And I hadn't listened to a lot of Waylon Jennings, and I listened to everything then. And I said, oh my God, I've got to do Waylon Jennings. And so that thus began my descent and decline into past elements of my life.
Well, I think listeners have gotten an idea that your career has been full of extraordinary moments, and that if they want a sense of hanging out with you, they will find more of that vibe, as they say, in Looking to Get Lost: Adventures in Music and Writing. Peter, thanks for being here to talk about it.
Oh, thanks so much. I've really enjoyed it.
There'd be a tombstone every mile.
Alex Ross is here. Since 1996, he has been the music critic at the New Yorker magazine, where he writes about classical music and other subjects as well. His first book, The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century, won the National Book Critics Circle Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His new book, which he's here to talk about, from Los Angeles, is Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. It's an account of the German composer Richard Wagner's vast cultural impact, both during his lifetime and maybe even more since. And there's a lot to get into. So without further ado, hi, Alex. Great to have you.
Thanks, John. It's great to be on the podcast.
As you emphasize in the book fairly early on, this is not a biography in the traditional sense. And I think the ism in the title tips us off to that. So what is this? Where would we shelve this book?
Yeah, it is a curious creation because Wagner himself falls dead on the second page. It's a little bit of a oblique joke there that we're in the aftermath of Wagner and his echoes and influences. And what it really is, more than a study of Wagner himself, it's about a particular period. The heart of the book is the fin de siècle, the great sort of decadent, aestheticist, symbolist, early modernist age, right around 1900. And this was the time at which Wagner's influence was at its height. But Wagner is just a singular phenomenon because his influence extended so far outside of music, into the arts, into literature, intellectual life, philosophy, and of course, politics. And there has never been a phenomenon quite like it. And there's never actually been a book that's tried to encompass the entire phenomenon. So for better or worse, that's what I tried to do in this quite long book, which I left a lot out of in the end.
Well, since that reach became so great in terms of other artists and philosophers and writers and all the rest, I'm curious about, obviously your primary job is as a music critic. And I wonder what the sort of kernel of while he was alive, there's almost like a shock of the new feeling, I think, sometimes in the way you described. There was something avant-garde about what he was doing. At the same time, obviously, it was very well known and popular. What do you think was in the music that was so different or that changed and made him a lightning rod that, for instance, someone else might not have been around the same period?
Partly this influence outside of music had to do with the fact that Wagner was so much more than a composer. I mean, he really was a theater artist who wrote the music for his own productions, as well as the librettos and conducted and shaped the productions. But there is something in the music which stood out very much from the music of the time. It seized people. It had this visceral effect. They seemed to be drawn into this stream of consciousness, into this dream world, into this kind of thrilling state where they were experiencing hallucinations of some sort. Something about this music really gets under the skin. It sort of leaves behind these kind of conventional demarcations. Here's an aria, here's a chorus, here's a duet. It's just all one continuous flow, always changing, always evolving to the next thing, which is a kind of experience that there's a sort of a proto-cinematic quality to Wagner, because it's sort of this amazing continuous flow of action.
And sort of a proto stream of consciousness in literature, which we'll get to. But is it accurate to say that it was kind of the arrival of modernism before a lot of other people caught up to it?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that Wagner was himself modernist, but he was certainly pointing toward modernism in a lot of ways. I mean, he was such a contradictory phenomenon. There was this very avant-garde aspect to his music, the beginning of Tristan and Isolde. You're sort of hovering at the edge of atonality, almost conventional harmony is sort of dissolving. But at the same time, he was a great populist and entertainer and was telling stories about heroes and swords and dragons. And so there are these leitmotifs in Wagner are earworms. They really penetrate and stick in the consciousness. So there's that double-sidedness to Wagner. He was very much a grand romantic artist, but also there is the side to him where you're entering these mysterious dream worlds and these kind of liminal psychological states. And this was the aspect of Wagner that modernists really picked up on and sort of other end-of-century avant-garde thinkers and artists.
Well, speaking of sides of him, you've got art and politics in the book's subtitle. So let's get into the politics before we turn back to the art, because obviously a lot of people nowadays have an image of Wagner, if they do, that has to do very much with the sort of march of German history from Nietzsche to Hitler, and it's not good for anyone's reputation to be Hitler's favorite anything, but Wagner was his favorite composer, and Wagner held and expressed anti-Semitic views himself. The book is really fascinating to read in the current moment because you've said elsewhere that if listeners feel too much revulsion to consider him, you quote-unquote respect the revulsion, which I love that phrase. And I think about less Titanic artists, but like the Smiths and people like that who get talked about on Twitter in terms of their current political thoughts. I always think it's just sort of lucky for people who make these judgments that most artists aren't capital G great. And there's a sense in your book that you really can't extricate Wagner from the history of this art because his influence is so wide. So how do you think we should situate him in terms of that political judgment and whether it should infect his work?
Yeah, I do respect the repulsion, the revulsion toward Wagner. I have felt it myself. I mean, my first images of Wagner were very negative, and early on, I really accepted the idea that he was a prophet of Nazism and had this very direct influence on Hitler. I'm not so sure about that now, but I recognize that there is this lineage, this very strong, direct lineage from Wagner's world to the world of Nazi Germany. But Wagner's politics were very complicated. And, there are aspects that point straight toward Nazism and there are aspects that point away. Earlier in his career, he was very much associated with the left, and he had to leave Germany in 1849 because of his involvement in the revolutionary uprising in Dresden in that year. And for a long time, he really was a hero of the left among communists, socialists, social democrats, anarchists, you name it. Wagner was seen as this great rebel and this populist who was bringing a new kind of art to the masses. And that goes straight into the early Bolshevik period, simultaneous with the rise of Nazism in Germany. And Wagner was anti-Semitic, but he did not really believe in the organized state in a certain way. He condemned the idea of a state with a standing army. And it's hard to picture, a totalitarian regime, without that fundamental principle. And so it's, the Nazis needed to be very selective as they made a propaganda symbol out of Wagner, and they had to omit, a lot from the picture. Same goes for the people on the left. They had to ignore Wagner's ultra-nationalist chauvinism and the anti-Semitism, unless they were anti-Semites themselves, which is a whole different problem. But the point is, Wagner's politics were just too complicated to be incorporated whole scale into a political ideology. However, the Nazis were able to use Wagner so effectively because those elements in Wagner were, in a sense, waiting to be activated. And the formulation that I go back to, which I think is so brilliant, is Thomas Mann saying that Wagner lent himself to his own misuse. And so he's saying, on the one hand, there was this distortion this misuse of Wagner in Nazi Germany, but at the same time, Wagner participated in that exploitation of his work. And, it's a complicated sort of nuanced formulation. It's not the kind of thing that'll be satisfying if you really want a thumbs up, thumbs down, is he good, is he evil answer to this question. But I think this is the reality. And, the Nazi element is very central to my story, but I don't want to omit the whole vast rest of this influence, which I think is easily obscured and forgotten when people focus so exclusively on the Hitler connection.
Luckily, your book focuses a lot on writers and authors. So for a books podcast, we can kind of get into both the music and the literary influences. One writer who I think, once you explain it, will make sense to people, and another that was surprising to me, the first is James Joyce, and sort of what kind of an influence Wagner had on him and how direct that was.
Well, the book is, more than anything, it is sort of a work of literary criticism. I haven't done the actual math, but, the lion's share of what I talk about in the book are poets, novelists, storytellers. Somehow they just responded to Wagner so avidly, so actively, not always approvingly, but there was sort of this impulse that came from Wagner. And Joyce was definitely one of those. He sort of went through this period of youthful, adolescent infatuation with Wagner, which was very, very common experience around the turn of the century. If you were a young man or a young woman of, sort of interested in culture, interested in art, just there were so many people who were swept away by Wagner in that period. And then Joyce retreated from it somewhat and kind of questioned, undermined, even mocked Wagnerism. So in Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus, very much the kind of image of the young James Joyce, has kind of lines of Wagner floating around in his head, and he's carrying his ash plant, his walking stick, which is a pretentious gesture in itself, around with him, and he's sort of imagining it as a sword. And so at the climactic moment in the brothel, he shouts "Notung," which is what Siegfried shouts as he's forging his sword, and he knocks against the chandelier. And it's this ridiculous, sort of this ridiculous drunken fantasy of being a hero. So Joyce is definitely mocking this Wagner fetish. But at the same time, he certainly learned something from Wagner in terms of leitmotifs, phrases that recur through the book, the technique of interior monologue, and stream of consciousness. He credited his conception of interior monologue to Edouard Dujardin, and Dujardin was an absolutely fanatical Wagnerian who co-founded the Revue Wagnerienne and wrote a quite fascinating novella, which was an attempt to sort of import the Wagnerian flow of sensation into the life of a single person over several hours, sort of going through his day. And sort of that's very much what Ulysses is as well. And above all, I think this manipulation of myth. And there's this kind of basic reversal that happens with Joyce and myth. In Wagner, you see gods, you see these sort of legendary stories, but they're modern mentalities and psychologies behind them. And the whole story of The Ring is kind of the story of the fall of a great bourgeois or aristocratic family. And it's also telling about revolutionary politics and upheaval. And with Joyce, the modernity, the contemporary sort of stories at the forefront, but with the story of the Odyssey and other intimations of myth, that's sort of lurking behind the scenes. So he sort of flipped that relationship. You can see notations in Wagner's writings by Joyce. He was very much aware of Joyce's ideas. And this very idea of sort of the combination of the wandering Jew and Odysseus, which is sort of the heart of what the kind of story of Ulysses is, that was articulated by Wagner in relation to the story of the Flying Dutchman. And there's no doubt that Joyce read that very passage and it got his attention.
I think I will reflect my own surprise by using one word, which is that now we go from Wagner and Joyce to Nebraska, and the American writer Willa Cather. She's someone who I was not expecting to see in this book. What was the Wagner line to her?
Well, this was one of the most enjoyable parts of the book to work on. And to some extent, it was a discovery for me over the 10 years that I spent working on this book. At the beginning, I had read some Cather, but I wouldn't have described myself as a really fanatical Catherian. And I became one. I absolutely became one. And I made several trips to Nebraska, to Red Cloud, to her hometown, and did research in the archive in Lincoln, and just got very, very deep into Cather. I'd always planned for her to have a major segment in this book, but it ended up being that she had her own chapter to herself, and she's the only figure in the entire book out of 15 chapters who has her own chapter. And I sort of think of it as it's a little bit of a respite from the other chapters, which are thronged full of different personalities and these sort of great kind of cultural forces colliding. And with Cather, we're just in one person's world. And she had a very kind of separate kind of relationship with Wagner. The sort of political questions and the philosophical questions weren't so much to the forefront. She just loved, just from a very early age, she loved the theater and actors and actresses and singers and performers. And that was how she understood Wagner as sort of this great theatrical event. But she was, I think, exposed to Wagner quite early on when she was still in Nebraska. She may have read about Wagner before she even heard the music. And I discovered that her childhood piano teacher was the son of a well-known German composer who actually knew Wagner. So there's a little odd direct connection there. And the novels are actually full of Wagnerian themes. One of her great novels, The Song of the Lark, is entirely the biography of a Wagner soprano. But there are many other stories in which there's sort of a more symbolic role for Wagner, and especially the image of the powerful heroine out on this great landscape in O Pioneers and My Antonia. You can sort of see her fondness for the figure of Brunhilde, especially Wagner's powerful female figures, and the singers who performed them had a great effect on her. So it was a lifelong relationship, and it gets richer and richer the more you look into it. But I just loved the whole experience of really falling in love with Cather's writing and going out there and getting to know Cather people, Cather scholars, and sort of amateur devotees, and even sort of distant relatives of Cather herself. And so I just loved that portion of the book.
This book is very capacious, and it is also told, much like your book, The Rest is Noise. I think that book, even on its flap copy, said something like it's a history of, not so much a history of music as history told through music. And I'm curious if I know you were listening to the music from a very early age, but if you can trace back to when you first started getting interested in that kind of threading history through the music rather than simply approaching music as sort of a straight criticism.
Well, I think it just has to do with my overlapping interests when I was growing up. I mean, I was very immersed in music from an early age and was trying to compose music, and I played the piano and the oboe. And at the same time, I was reading literature, studying history. I was especially just a huge history buff when I was growing up. And in college, I ended up majoring in English literature, but also took quite a few history courses. And so I always wanted to find the links between the music that interested me and the sort of the surrounding cultural context. And right from the beginning of my career as a critic, that was just very much my mission, first and foremost, writing about classical music as a living art and writing about living composers. But then, showing how this music is not sort of in this remote sphere in an ivory tower. It's just in the thick of history unfolding. And that excited me. And I think it sort of helps people to find a relationship with a body of work that is, remote for a lot of people, and they haven't really grown up immersed in it as I was. And so, especially when I'm in this period of the late 19th century, early 20th century, which I've just been attracted to over and over again from my teenage years when I read Karl Schorsky's Fin de siècle Vienna, among other books, that had a huge effect on me. And so any kind of zone where I can sort of see music being sort of woven in with society, culture, and politics attracts me. And, the 20th century and the story of composers in the 20th century was one very rich story to explore in that sense. And with Wagner and Wagnerism, it's even richer in a sense. I mean, there's just no case where the question of politics and ideology is so overwhelming and unavoidable in the history of art than I think with Wagner.
It's been a strange year, obviously. And as someone who sees a lot of live music performances, how have you been dealing with that? What have you been missing? When do you imagine getting back to it?
It's been difficult. I mean, of course, not nearly as difficult as this whole period has been for a lot of people, I've been able to continue working and continue writing. But, I have felt as though I've just been grasping at straws sometimes in terms of sort of finding material to write about without live performance, because, in the usual state of things, there's so much to choose from, and I can sort of feel free to seize on what interests me and run with it. And now, the landscape is quite sparse. As we speak, coming up is the first major live event. I've seen a couple of very small-scale drive-in concerts over the summer, but the first major event will be, strange to say, Wagner in Detroit. The brilliant director Yuval Sharon is putting together an abridged production of Götterdämmerung in a parking garage in Detroit for the Michigan Opera Theater. And so it's kind of funny that Wagner, of all people, the biggest, the most complicated, of all composers, is the one that I'll be sort of, it'll be my point of re-entry into live music. But, Götterdämmerung is a perfectly kind of fitting topic for these days. The twilight of the gods, the sort of the end of the old world, hopefully the beginning of something new.
Well put.
And
yes.
And there's actually a lot happening. There's a tremendous number of streams and, orchestras putting on concerts for a limited audience or no audience, and string quartets and new music ensembles creatively doing things. So there's actually a lot to talk about. But, I just constantly have this sense of how tremendously difficult and this existential crisis going on in the performing arts, where people just aren't able to make a living and to continue working as they usually do. And it was a sort of, iffy proposition to begin with, to make your life in the performing arts. So I just feel this sadness, of all this work that was lost and all these careers that are being interrupted, and even some people who are just giving up on the idea of being a musician and sort of getting another job. And so it's a very, very sad time. And when things resume, it's not going to be the same, and it will take many, many years for us to recover in the performing arts world from this catastrophe.
Well, if Wagner in a Detroit parking garage isn't proof that he pops up in the weirdest of places, I don't know what is. And your book is a good place for people to see where else that has happened over the course of the last 140 years or so. The book is Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music by Alex Ross. Alex, thanks for being here to talk about it.
Thanks, John.
Alexandra Alter joins me now with news from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, John.
You recently covered in a piece that you wrote with our colleague Liz Harris about some big and continuing changes in the publishing industry. What's going on out there?
So it was very interesting this summer when across the country there were protests against police brutality and racial injustice, and you kind of saw different industries respond to it, sometimes with temporary expressions of support like an Instagram campaign. But in publishing, there was a really, I think, prolonged discussion about racial inequality and the lack of diversity, both in terms of who gets published, what gets published, and the employee base of these large publishing companies. And so, interestingly, the discussion didn't die down after the protests largely did, although there's, still taking place. The larger kind of national movement has somewhat subsided. And we've seen large publishing companies really make a sustained effort to recruit and hire editors and publishers who come from diverse backgrounds, to start new imprints that are diversity focused. And so this week there were some really interesting promotions and hires. One occurred at Hachette Books, which is starting a new imprint called Legacy Lit, and it's run by Christian Trotman. She's a Black woman. She has more than 15 years of experience in publishing, and she pitched this imprint to the company's CEO over the summer when she said she was seeing all this discussion both internally in the company and in publishing at large about the lack of diversity and the need for more diverse voices in what gets published. And so she said, let's do something that sends a signal to the publishing world, to writers, that, we're committed to this. And so that's exactly what they did. They announced it this week. Their first list is going to start coming out in January of 22, and she already has a pretty robust roster of authors.
That's quick by publishing standards,
it's
January
rather
2022.
Quick, yeah, exactly. The other interesting new hire this week was at Simon & Schuster. So Simon & Schuster earlier this year recruited Dana Kennedy. She was a former New York Times editor and an administrator of the Pulitzer Prizes, and she has now become become the publisher of their namesake imprint. And she has done some interesting recruiting herself. This week, they announced that they're bringing on Aminda Marquez Gonzalez, who's the executive editor of the Miami Herald, where I used to work a long, long time ago. And she is going to come on and be vice president and executive editor of Simon & Schuster. So this is interesting for a number of reasons. She's going to remain in Miami. And as we all know, publishing is extremely New York centric. All the major houses are based here. Most of the literary agents are based here. Some of the big trade shows and things. So this is kind of adding some geographic diversity as well. And she's someone from outside of traditional publishing, just as Dana Kennedy herself is.
A lot of ex-newspaper people.
Yeah, a lot of ex-newspaper people.
An interesting route. I went from publishing to newspapers.
Yes. I suppose magazines have been a more typical kind of path. But I do think it's interesting. There is obviously some overlap, and you see some crossover with long-form journalism. A lot of journalists write books. But the fact that people are coming into the industry at a very high level is kind of interesting. It's typically been a pretty insular business where the expectation is that you start as a lowly assistant and work your way up over the decades. And finally, if you're lucky, you get to be publisher one day. So that was an interesting new hire, I thought, and we'll see what kind of books and authors she brings on.
I got the sense from your article, and like you're saying here, that in terms of the geographic diversity, because she's staying in Miami not because of the pandemic, but it sounded like just full-time and always, no matter what happens, she'll be in Miami.
Exactly. And I think that will give her a different network. You know, she'll have connections to writers and authors there and maybe, you know, in the South in general and the Southeast. She's Cuban American, so she has that background too. So it'll be very interesting, I think, to see how that influences what Simon & Schuster is picking up and publishing. At the same time, Simon & Schuster announced that they're closing down one of their diversity-focused imprints, which is 37 Inc. And this has happened after the publisher of 37 Inc., Don Davis, left to become executive editor of Bon Appetit. So then we have a little bit of publishing going back into journalism. There's a lot of interesting back and forth occurring.
And I thought Dana Kennedy's quote about that was interesting in terms of why they're closing it down.
Yes, I thought Dana Kennedy's explanation of why they decided to close the imprint was very interesting. She said that the imprint's existence, quote, allowed people to say, oh, that's a 37 Inc. book, go talk to Don Davis, whereas now agents and authors will see Simon & Schuster overall as a place for books by authors of color and books about racial injustice and things like that. So I think they felt that having an imprint focused on diversity was maybe creating like a little silo for those books, and they want them to be published across the board.
I get the sense, as you said earlier, that this is a continuing effort, and that unlike some industries, that there's some real wrestling and sort of long-term structural changes going on. So I don't imagine this will be the last time we talk to you about this, which is heartening.
I think we'll be talking about this a lot going forward. And of course, we're going to start to see a whole new crop of books come out of these new imprints and, you know, a new generation of writers. So that's going to be a few years down the road, but certainly a lot to look forward to and to talk about.
Yeah, and to help you guide us through it. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Our critics Dwight Garner and Jennifer Salai join me now to talk about some of their latest reviews. Hi, guys. How are you both?
Hey, John.
Hey, John. Good.
We're talking about two very different but interesting figures this week. They're biographies of a sort. Dwight, let's start with you. What did you review?
I reviewed a new biography of Richard Avedon, the photographer. It's called What Becomes a Legend Most. And it's from Philip Gefter, who's a photography writer who was an editor at the Times. He's no longer is, but was for 15 years a ways back. And his book is quite good. I mean, Richard Avedon is really sort of, you know, a seminal figure. And his career was so long that there's so much to dig into. I mean, he sort of changed the nature and the face of fashion photography with his sort of bold and minimal stuff, black and white he did for Harper's Bazaar, you know, back to the 1940s. And he was still doing work for the New Yorker, you know, in the beginning of the aughts. And in between, he made some of the great portraits in photographic history. I mean, his shots of everyone from early Marilyn Monroe to the Chicago 7 to the Andy Warhol's group to, you know, a lot of his images became posters on dorm room walls. We all remember that photo of Natasha Kinski where she's nude with the snake wrapped around her and it's kind of flicking her ear. And he did those psychedelic shots of the Beatles that was made into a poster with 4 segments, colorized. That was an Avedon as well. The great story that Gefter has to tell about Avedon is that because of his early photographic work, he wasn't really taken seriously by the photography establishment, as it were, as it grew. I mean, serious sort of downtown artists like Robert Frank and Diane Arbus, although he and Arbus were friends, he wanted to be taken seriously as an artist, and he always felt that he never quite was.
And he was seen more as sort of a brilliant celebrity photographer almost.
Yeah, celebrity photographer, and he was a great showman. His shows were always really well mounted and hung, and there was always just sort of a lot of glitter, and he hung out with rich people. I mean, his best friends were people like, Mike Nichols and Leonard Bernstein, and he was incredibly wealthy later in his career. And it's fun to read about him because he's the kind of guy who, for example, and I'm so envious of this, if he liked to play on Broadway, he'd go see it 11 times, and if he liked to play that was running in Stockholm, a production of a Eugene O'Neill play, he would fly over 6 times to see it and bring different friends every time, which is like, if I were rich, maybe that's what I would do with my money. I don't know. There are a lot of charming details, and it's a well done book.
And you're saying the story he has to tell is about Avedon's desire to be seen as more than that. And where does Gefter come down on that? He
makes a very compelling case for Avedon as a major artist of the 20th century, and sets him alongside a lot of the great portrait makers throughout history, from Nadar to Sander to a lot of other people. And, there's also a good story in just, Avedon's childhood. I mean, he was one of those kids who was gay and Jewish. People told him he threw a baseball like a girl. He was picked on, and he had a nose job when he was 17 that his father paid for. He was sort of, in many ways, self-hating. And in many ways, even as a gay man, he never came out of the closet. Even when his more famous friends, like Leonard Bernstein and other people did, he remained in the closet. He was married twice and had kids, but it's pretty clear that he was a gay man in the closet.
Is the book pretty dishy about his private life?
Not really. There was a previous biography. I mean, yes, let me say, it is pretty dishy, but it's not intrusively and bizarrely dishy. There was a previous book about Avedon that by one of his assistants, which is not as good as this book, not as complete, who she wrote that Avedon had a long affair with Mike Nichols, that it went on for, I forget how many years, but many years. And Gefter thinks it's possible they might have slept together, but he's pretty dubious that Avedon and Nichols had a long running relationship.
So he's not aiming for maximum prurience at every turn.
No. And one of the best parts of this book, he sort of frames this, is Avedon an artist or not? He frames it through the life of John Sarkowski, who was the director of photography at the Met. He was the man who sort of was the kingmaker and who picked the major photography shows. And he sort of was wary of Avedon and never really gave him the time of day. Gefter in this book kind of details their give and take over the years, and it's pretty fascinating.
Jen, you reviewed a book recently about another man who dreamt of great fortune and was very ambitious. So far, his story ended pretty differently. What was the book you reviewed?
So the book I reviewed this week was $1 Billion Loser, and the subtitle is The Epic Rise and Spectacular Fall of Adam Neumann and WeWork. And it's by a journalist at New York Magazine named Reeves Weideman. And, it was funny, actually, John, when you and I were going through the piece, one of the things that I sort of realized when I had written it was that I assumed that everybody knew what WeWork was, but I think that might be a New York thing. So for the listeners who don't necessarily know what it is, it's essentially an office renting company. And so what Adam Neumann figured out, and this was in 2010 when he co-founded this company, was that this was in the wake of the financial crisis, and he could get long-term leases on office space in New York on the cheap and, reconfigure them and essentially rent them out to a bunch of tenants, mostly freelancers, at a markup for short-term leases. And so he would take on the risk of having this long-term lease, and he would rake in the money and make a profit from people who didn't necessarily want a long-term lease.
Was this an immediate success?
Yeah, at the beginning, actually, it seemed to work out quite well. And in 2012, WeWork was actually profitable. But that turns out to be perhaps the only profitable year in the company's history. And, WeWork still exists, but it should be said that Adam Neumann is no longer at the head of it. He has stepped down. For a while, they attracted lots of money from venture capital firms like Benchmark, which is a very reputable firm, as well as SoftBank, the Japanese tech conglomerate. And, what happened since 2012 is essentially costs outran revenue. And that partly has to do just with the nature of the business itself. I mean, the only way to really expand WeWork was to take on more costs. I mean, that's how real estate works. And the market was changing. And then it also had to do with Neumann's own management style, which was the way it's described in the book, he was extremely profligate with money. I mean, he was just spending all the time. And he had this idea that he could really dominate the market, which, for a business like this is not necessarily the best strategy for turning a profit because you keep incurring costs. I mean, that's just the way it was. So Newman at a certain point decided he was going to be a tech visionary, even though he didn't even really use a computer. And so what he did was he wanted to scale, because that's the whole idea about tech, is that you can scale without incurring the costs of, what typical real estate expansion would entail. And so he thought that he could really turn WeWork not just into this actual community of co-working spaces, but also some sort of tech social network where people would connect. But of course, there are other tech social networks that exist.
Have any of us ever been in a WeWork? Have you been in one, Jen or John?
I've never stepped into one. Have you, John?
Well, I think I was in someone's office in the early aughts that was renting the space through WeWork. But I think once you're in the office, it just sort of looks like another small carve-out office with cubicles. I mean, what's strange is that, I'm hardly an expert on these things, but I did find myself early on when it was proliferating, I did kind of suspect, like, why is this? I know that there's a business for freelancers in New York, but it just seemed to be outgrowing what I considered to be what this might. It's not like Starbucks.
Right. The co-working spaces still exist. And, even though Newman stepped down and they have had trouble with funding, and the pandemic, I think, has really undermined this business model, at least for now. The spaces still exist. I'm not sure if now maybe they have some protocols in place. I'm actually not sure at the moment whether people can go into the offices or even if they might want to.
This all sort of built to a crescendo last year, right? Because the IPO, I think it was last year, that they had an IPO where the company was just massively overvalued.
Well, this was exactly it. Yes. The overvaluation kept sort of spiraling out of control. And then eventually, as these things do, it crashed. And so they postponed their IPO indefinitely. Newman stepped down. Since then, Newman has actually sued SoftBank because he claims that SoftBank promised like a certain buyout for him. And so the whole thing has turned into another kind of saga since the story that Weidman actually tells in this book. But the book is fascinating. It's totally absorbing. I mean, Weidman as a narrator is very understated, which I actually think is really good for a story like this because you have a gigantic personality in the person of Adam Newman. And so Weidman just chooses the anecdotes really carefully, meets them out so that the evidence accrues. And I think it's also interesting to see because you really do see the arc of this, I guess you could call it a career, where, he was very good at convincing people. There was something about his personality, even though the ideas that he was presenting, some of it just sounded so harebrained. And it should be said, I didn't include this in the review, but before starting WeWork, he had these other entrepreneurial ideas that he had gotten off the ground that didn't really do that well. And his first one, I think, was this idea of clothes for babies that had knee pads so that when they learned how to crawl, they wouldn't hurt their knees. And it was called Crawlers with a K.
Oh, God.
Was that an epidemic?
His big idea.
Infant knee problems?
Right. He didn't have children at the time. So he was this young guy, I think he was in his 20s, and this was this idea that he hatched. But I think a lot of parents probably wondered if they actually needed knee pads for their crawling children. This was not necessarily a problem that had presented itself that needed a solution.
The whole arc of the story is very redolent of the tech world, and yet his ideas are so non-tech.
I know, it's very material.
Anytime you see a K in front of a word that has to do with children, you need to run really quickly. It's like that Cars for Kids ad. It's something about the K in front of anything to do with children is a sign.
Now it's going to be stuck in my head all day. Thanks, Dwayne. Well, thanks for being here, both of you, to talk about 2 meteoric rises and 1 spectacular fall. Dwight and Jen, let's talk again about what you reviewed.
I reviewed What Becomes a Legend Most, a biography of Richard Avedon, written by Philip Gefter.
And I reviewed $1 Billion Loser, the epic rise and spectacular fall of Adam Newman and WeWork by Reeves Weidman.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.